Hey there, ho there, hi there. This is Dr. DiMaio. We are doing the endocrine system with a video narration. I hope you enjoy it. You're looking at this first page, an introductory page, and on this side it just talks about the different glands of the endocrine system with some of the hormones associated with it. Then you see the hierarchy of control here with the hypothalamus, which is a portion of the brain, directing everything else in the endocrine system, at the same time producing some hormones, and they stored in the posterior pituitary glands such as ADH and oxytocin. And the general hierarchy is that the hypothalamus releases releasing factors or inhibiting factors to affect the anterior pituitary gland, and it does produce some other hormones like we just said. Then these releasing factors will affect the anterior pituitary gland to release their tropic hormones, which have a tropic effect on the different glands that produce their hormones. So they're tropic. See, adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, growth hormone, and so on are going to these different glands and they release their hormones. So adrenocorticotropic hormone affects the adrenal cortex, and adrenal cortex hormones include the corticosteroids, and the thyroid stimulating hormone includes the thyroid hormone. So that's just some examples of that. And of course, we're going to be looking at both male and female. Now, the major endocrine glands and organs are listed right here. And if you can see here, the hypothalamus is part of the brain. So we have this thing called the neuroendocrine system, really. We say endocrine, but it's really a neuroendocrine system because the hypothalamus is the control center for all hormones. Yes, the pituitary gland is the master gland of all the other glands, but the hypothalamus controls it. You have a thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the ovaries, testes, and pineal gland, as well as the thymus gland. Here you see it again, hypothalamus up top, and it's like that little section right in there. So a thalamus is kind of like in this area here, but right at the bottom, like a triangle, is the hypothalamus. And then this tiny little dot is the pineal gland. It's so tiny, it's very tiny. And then you see the pituitary gland has two parts, an anterior and a posterior pituitary gland. These are the hormones that are released there. Again, this is showing you the hypothalamus. Now you see a real close-up. You're taking a picture of this spot right here, and you can see the bottom of the thalamus called the hypo, below the thalamus, bottom of the thalamus, the hypothalamus portion of the brain. And here are direct neurons going right into that posterior pituitary gland. And then this is the anterior pituitary gland, where it's receiving the secretory hormones or releasing factors to tell it to release its hormones. So hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus actually can control and regulate hormone function. And then secondarily, the pituitary has a control, right? And so you have two parts of the pituitary gland. You have the neurohypophysis and you have the adenohypophysis. So the adenohypophysis is in the front. This is the adenohypophysis here, and this is the neurohypophysis. Notice if you look at this picture, there's something totally different about this. This doesn't look like the same as that, does it? This is showing you that there's all neurons in here. This is showing you that there's all glandular tissue. And in between is the pars intermedia. Can we go back? Oh, mamma mia. Okay. So we did this slide once before. So this is just a review, really. Stimulating or tropic, this says trophic. You can use trophic or you can use tropic. And that's found in the anterior or adeno, same thing, anterior pituitary gland. Adeno prefix means glandular. And these are some of those tropic hormones, FSH, and that can release, have a stimulation. It's a follicle stimulating hormone. And on males, it increases spermatogenesis, the production of sperm. And in females, it causes the maturation of the ovum. Luteinizing hormone also has an effect on both male and female gonads. In males, it increases testosterone levels. And in females, it stimulates estrogen and progesterone levels, increasing them as well. The ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, it causes the adrenal cortex to produce hormones such as glucocorticoid family, and they include your cortisol, cortisone, and corticosteroid. TSH, like we said before, is a thyroid stimulating hormone, and it causes the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone is made up of T3 or triiodothyronine or T4 thyroxine. Here is the hypothalamus portal system. That's what we're looking at here. Now you see this incredible capillary network, and all this stuff goes into the capillaries, and it's a portal system to bring these chemicals to the pituitary and from the pituitary to the rest of the body. This is the anterior or adenohypophysis, and it's going to secrete, like we said, the tropic hormones. This is the infundibulum or the pars intermedius or pars media. That's going to secrete MSH. And this is the posterior or neurohypophysis, and that produces and releases ADH and oxytocin. The histology of the pituitary gland, just like I just said, adeno means glandular. That's the anterior. The pars intermedia is the septa, and the neuro is the nerve tissue in the back. Okay. So this is the general feedback system associated with the endocrine system or neuroendocrine system. You have hypothalamic hormones or releasing hormones that go to the anterior pituitary gland. That hypothalamic releasing hormone is going to trigger the anterior pituitary gland to release a hormone, which is this hormone is going to be considered a tropic hormone. And if it's going to the adrenals, it's called adrenal corticotropic hormone, right? Or a stimulating hormone. And it's going to go to the specific organ, endocrine organ, that's going to make the hormone that it's trying to tell it to release. So if it's going to release, thyroid hormone, this would release TSH. This would be the thyroid, and then the thyroid would release its thyroid hormones, get into the blood circulation, and go to the target cells. Once the hormones are released, the hypothalamus will monitor all the overall levels of that hormone in the body, and then can send out inhibiting hormones if the levels are too high. So besides sending out the releasing hormones, the hypothalamus can inhibit the production of hormones. And these inhibiting hormones have an inhibitory effect on the anterior pituitary gland and will stop the release of those hormones until the levels normalize. Okay. So a releasing hormone goes here, or an inhibiting hormone can go here to stop the release. Anterior pituitary gland or adenohypophysis receives directions from the hypothalamus as releasing inhibiting hormones or inhibiting hormones. HRH, meaning hypothalamic releasing hormone, are specific to cause the adenohypophysis to release its corresponding tropic hormone associated. The specific endocrine organ now releases its hormone, let's say it's thyroid hormone, and then that enters the bloodstream and travels to its target cells for its specific receptors on the cells of that specific hormone. So here it's showing you a prolactin inhibiting and prolactin releasing factor. So a prolactin inhibiting hormone or prolactin releasing factor is coming from the hypothalamus and will tell the anterior pituitary gland either to make prolactin if it's a releasing factor, or to stop making it if it's an inhibiting factor. Okay, here's the thyroid right here, and here is the thyroid cartilage, and here's the hyoid bone, and this is found in the mid-neck area, like C3, C4, maybe C5 on some people, and the thyroid cells are the only cells in the body which can absorb iodine. That's pretty cool. Why? Because they have to make a hormone that is actually made up of iodine, and it's called triiodothyronine. So these cells combine iodine and amino acid tyrosine to make T3, T4. T3 and T4 are released into the bloodstream. They're transported throughout the body, and they help to control metabolism. Every cell in your body basically has a receptor for these hormones. And these are actually from an amino acid base, and they're not lipid soluble. These are thyroid hormones. And then calcitonin is another hormone produced by the thyroid gland, but from different cells. So we have these things called C cells, and those cells are specific to make calcitonin, and calcitonin is involved in regulating blood calcium as well. It kind of opposes parathyroid hormone. Here's those little guys. This is the parathyroid glands. This is the thyroid. This whole thing is the thyroid, right? And then these are the parathyroid glands, these four little guys right here. See, parathyroid glands. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. And there are four small glands in the endocrine system which regulate the calcium in our body. So PTH, they produce PTH or parathormone or parathyroid hormone, and they have a profound effect on calcium levels in our body. Here's the pancreas. That pancreas is mostly digestive. It's only 1% endocrine. So hormones are only produced in 1% of this gland, specifically in the islets of Langerhans. Now our book has, in a lab, it says there's 4 types of cells. There's alpha, beta, delta, and F cells. So let's just focus on these for right now. The alpha cells secrete glucagon, and that elevates blood glucose. So when you're not eating a meal, you should be able to release blood glucose from the pancreas and also the liver. And you could do it from skeletal muscle, but in the pancreas, there are cells specifically called the alpha cells that secrete glucagon. And then the beta cells are for insulin production, and they lower blood glucose. And the F cells are associated with somatostatin, and they say it's identical to growth hormone inhibitory hormone. And there's a D cell as well. Let's not worry about that right now. Okay, let's go on to this next. Glucagon, extremely potent hyper. That means too high. Whoa, blood sugar just went really high. So it elevates blood sugar. 1 molecule of glucagon can release 100 million molecules of glucose into the bloodstream, and it accomplishes by stimulating the liver. Because the liver stores glycogen, and that can get converted into glucose and be released. It causes the breakdown of stored glycogen into glucose, known as glycogenolysis. It also can trigger the breakdown of other substances such as lactic acid, fats, and proteins, converting them through a process called gluco, like gluco, right? It means sugar, neogenesis. That's the making of sugar from something other than a sugar product. So it actually can convert lactic acid, which is the end product of muscle contraction, and it can convert fats and proteins into glucose. Good deal, right? Insulin, it binds to cell receptors on the cell membranes, activates something inside the cell called tyrosine kinase. That tyrosine kinase phosphorylates. Okay, so kinase means it's an enzyme. Phosphorylation means it's going to add phosphates, and usually has to do with high energy. So it phosphorylates proteins, beginning a series of events that increase the cell's ability to take up glucose. When glucose enters the target cells, it also triggers enzymes to act as a catalyst to break down glucose to form ATP. It can join glucose molecules together to form glycogen, or it can convert glucose to fat. Somatostatin is identical to growth hormone. Actually, it should say growth hormone inhibiting factor. Okay. Adrenals or suprarenal glands are glands found on top of your kidneys, and they have a medulla in the center. See, that's the medulla in the center. And then the cortex is around, and of course they have a capsule on the top. That's the capsule there. The cortex releases is going to release hormones in response to cortical releasing hormone, which will have an effect on the anterior pituitary gland, right? And the anterior pituitary gland will release adrenal corticotropic hormone, which then causes the cortex to release their glucocorticoids. Adrenals or suprarenal glands, each adrenal gland has an outer, like I said, cortex, and in a darker medulla. The gland is wrapped by a connective tissue capsule. The medulla is stimulated directly by myelinated preganglionic sympathetic neurons that exit the mid-thoracic spine. So those are the only link we see in the body like that. We have myelinated neurons entering a gland directly. All the others have to do have to go to a ganglion first, and there'll be preganglionic fibers, and then they synapse in the ganglia. And when they synapse in the ganglia, the postganglionic fibers that go into the gland that tell it to do its job are non-myelinated, which is very slow. That's why the adrenals can be release hormones immediately. Also note that motor neurons that cause your heart to increase its rate and force of contraction extend from the upper thoracic spine and release adrenaline as well at the cardioplexus. And the adrenal cortex is stimulated by the anterior pituitary hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or corticotropin. The adrenocorticotropin hormone is released in response to corticotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And the adrenal cortex hormones include the corticosteroids, the gonadocorticoids, and the mineralocorticoids. In the testes, we have testosterone being produced by cells called the interstitial cells. Here they are. And then you have the seminiferous tubules is where the sperm are produced. And these are the seminiferous tubules. Let's see, this would be it, right? Okay. This kind of breaks down the production of those hormones. And this one does it in the female. So female ovaries, the estrogen and progesterone maintain the female sex characteristics. You said we're going to... Okay, that was a phone call. Sorry about that. So the kidneys do produce this hormone called EPO. And it's pretty famous because the Olympic athletes will be using that almost every Olympic games. There are people getting snagged with synthetic EPO. And what it does, it elevates your red blood cells. And when you elevate your red blood cells, it elevates your endurance because you get a more oxygen carrying capability. And the kidneys are the perfect monitor for blood flow because they have to filter the blood, and when the blood pressure is low, it monitors it and tries to increase the pressure locally within the nephron, which are the tiny filtering units within the kidney itself. And they have little muscles around the vessels that squeeze and increase pressure. And then there are cells that can detect the pressure, and they are giving input back to the entire body. And you can have also the production of renin, which enters the blood and is converted into angiotensin 1. When it reaches the lungs, it gets converted to angiotensin 2, and that can cause further vasoconstriction and increase in your blood pressure. So by increasing your volume of blood with EPO and increasing the pressure with renin and the angiotensin 1 and 2 system, you can elevate blood pressure and elevate blood volume. At the same time, when you increase volume, you got to have more pressure, and when you restrict the flow, it increases the pressure more. And also, we know the kidneys are associated in the production of vitamin D3, and so they're important in that process as well. Some pathologies of endocrine organs. We have a growth hormone disorder called giantism. It's a hyper, too much. Hyper means too much secretion of growth hormone. So the baby grows and grows and grows and keeps growing, and they get very long limbs, long heads, and long fingers. And then if it keeps going on, they will get acromegaly when they're older. So giantism is from a hypersecretion of growth hormone, as is acromegaly in the adult. In the adult, they're still producing too much growth hormone, but the bones are done growing because they close the growth plates, but connective tissue thickens. And we talked about the thickening of connective tissue in people with acromegaly. They're very tall, sometimes 8, 9 feet tall, 7, 8, 9 feet tall. and they have a very thick forehead and thick jaw, and the thick forehead is called frontal embossing. We discussed the possibility of Goliath in the Bible being an acromegaly patient, and how the thrown stone actually embedded into his forehead. And I tell you to touch your forehead with your finger and feel the thickness of the tissue. It's not thick enough for a stone to embed into the skin and this connective tissue. But on an acromegaly person, it's very thick, and that makes that story much more possible. Okay, diabetes insipidus is a pituitary disorder. This is a different kind of diabetes. Notice the word is insipidus, not mellitus. And so diabetes insipidus is a reduction in the production of antidiuretic hormone. And it's usually from a brain stroke, a tumor, or trauma. And it's characterized by increased urine production and secretion and thirst. And the urine is usually very hypotonic, very clear, mostly water. And it's treated by ADH and tested by doing a 24-hour urine and looking at not only the volume of urine the person is producing over a 24-hour period of time, but the concentration of that urine being very low concentrated with solute. So it's a hypotonic. It doesn't have much solute, mostly pure water. Thyroid disorders, you've heard of goiter, and we said goiter is the thickening and enlargement of the thyroid gland. It can be due to iodine reduction in their diet, a lack of iodine, or radiation poisoning. I have discussed how I saw a patient in the Ukraine, and she had super high blood pressure, plus she had a goiter, and she lived very close to Chernobyl. It was only a few years after that. Thyroiditis is another type of disease associated with environmental toxins, and it's an autoimmune disorder where your body attacks the thyroid. It's characterized by both hyper and hypothyroid symptoms. They fluctuate on and off. Babies born with a deficient thyroid hormone from a mother who is iodine deficient or had a problem with thyroid production are usually smaller and mentally handicapped. The parathyroid glands, known as are behind the thyroid gland, 4 tiny glands. They can produce parathyroid hormone, and they can affect your calcium levels. And if you have problems with it, it can cause osteopenia. And so osteoporosis is also associated with lack of calcium, but osteoporosis is different than osteopenia in that osteoporosis is not just a lack of minerals, but it's a lack of proteins too. And the bone looks more porous. Your pancreas is associated with glucose, and we said it's only 1% endocrine, and in the endocrine area is called the islets of Langerhans, and you can have something called hypoglycemia, it's low blood sugar, characterized by low serum glucose levels. And there's 3 basic types. There's reactive hypoglycemia, spontaneous hypoglycemia, and there's alcohol-induced hypoglycemia. Reactive hypoglycemia is due to an overabundance of carbs. A person's diet is always sugars. Spontaneous hypoglycemia is due to overmetabolism of glucose or reduction of glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Alcohol-induced hypoglycemia is associated with an impaired liver function and reduces the glycogenolysis and glucogenolysis. And then diabetes mellitus is 2 types. We did this in the lab, and type 1 is insulin dependent, and it's usually also known as juvenile diabetics. They need to have insulin to survive. The insulin they make is either the wrong type or it just doesn't function. Type 2 is non-insulin dependent. It's usually after age 40 the cells become resistant and the pancreas gets tired, basically. And we already did the testes. This is a typo.